With data breaches in the headlines virtually every day, your organization's sensitive data is at risk more than ever before. What are your obligations, and what can you do to comply with new data protection legislation? I'm Tom Reeve, Deputy Editor of scmagazineuk.com, and today I'm joined by two speakers, Fran Howarth and Charles Goldberg, who are going to take us on a guided tour through this data minefield. Protection of personal data has been a European obsession for a couple of decades now, ever since the EU Data Protection Directive of 1995. The technology has moved on, and in a bid to keep up with the times, the EU is set to approve within the next month or two the General Data Protection Regulation, which will raise the bar for data protection in ways beyond my comprehension. Fortunately, we have Fran, who will shed some light on this mysterious subject for me. Fran is a senior security analyst at Bloor Research, and she'll take us through best practices to securing your data within EU regulation. Fran specializes in information technology and security, and for more than 20 years has advised organizations as an analyst, consultant, and writer on security technologies for business. Then we'll hear from Charles, who is Senior Director of Product Marketing at Vormetric. He also has 20 years experience in a broad range of fields, including research, sales engineering, product management, and marketing in networking and security. With a master's degree in computer science from Johns Hopkins University, his current interests center around securing data at rest. He is concerned that it has become easy prey for hackers and is thus ripe for innovation. So I'd like to welcome both of you, and with that introduction, I'd like to hand you over to Fran and Charles.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm going to start by introducing the new General Data Protection Regulation of the EU. 7 out of 10 organisations are worried about the impact of this new regulation and are planning to make investments in technology. The first Data Protection Directive was introduced 20 years ago in 1995. Prior to this, some countries did have their own regulations. France was one of the first. It introduced its legislation in 1978, and this was seen as the model for the new directive that was introduced in 1995. In the 2 years after that, it was ratified into each member state legislation into their own laws. When it was first introduced, it was seen as one of the most stringent data protection legislations in the world, and it introduced a number of principles that every state must abide by. Among these are that data subjects must be notified and give their consent, and they should have the right to access their personal data that is held on them, and to object to any inaccuracies, and to hold collectors accountable for inaccuracies so that they can be changed. Data that is collected can only be used for the specific purpose for which it was collected, and no other. And high standards of security were required, but it really actually only says appropriate technical and organisational measures, and there was no prescriptive technology called out whatsoever in the directive. Since the directive was introduced, every member state has added extra clauses to their legislation, and this has created a legal minefield for organisations that operate in more than one country across Europe. It was also onerous, and they had to inform and gain the approval of the Data Protection Authority in every country in which they operate, which was costly and time-consuming. Over time, sanctions have been imposed by various states and for non-compliance, and these vary widely. Spain is one of the strictest, and they have fines of up to 600,000 euros, and they often fine. I believe that last year they fined 20 million something euros, whereas in France, the fines are a very low level and are rarely dished out. In the original directive, there was no breach notification. In fact, there were no breach notification mandated anywhere in the world until 2002, when California passed its first act. Now most US states have data breach notification mandates. In 2002, the EU introduced the e-privacy directive, which has been modified several times since. This is the only legislation that actually has mandatory breach notification, and it is for providers of electronic services only. Over the years, some countries have introduced breach notification, such as Germany. The UK is another, which specifies serious breaches, in which organisations are urged to take into account the number of breaches, the number of individuals affected, and the likelihood of harm to those individuals. Today, every organisation is data-driven. It's often said that 80% of all information is held electronically, but I would actually say that's probably gone up to 90%. When the Data Protection Directive was introduced, the Internet was in its infancy, and less than 1% of the world's population was connected to the Internet. Today, that figure is more about 40%, and in developed countries it's considerably higher. Over the years, mobile devices have proliferated, and almost everyone seems to have a mobile on them and are constantly checking them. The consumerization of IT has also been another factor, whereby corporate-owned devices, corporate-issued devices, are less likely to be seen, and people have their own devices of their choice, which makes it harder for organizations to control. Cloud services have also expanded. For example, in the UK, 84% of enterprises are using cloud services. Data has become the lifeblood of organizations, and the security of corporate information is seen as the most serious cybersecurity risk, followed by reputational or brand damage. Today, security breaches are everyday news, and they have been grown in volume and severity. 2014 was dubbed the year of the mega breach, and we saw many major retailers and major banks hit by massive breaches, of which the fallout was severe. Reputations were damaged, revenues fell, and executives lost their jobs. Those breaches are continuing, and the data on this slide is actually just the tip of the iceberg, because organizations around the world do not actually have yet to notify breaches. The new data protection regulation was introduced in order to restore a level playing field across the EU and to make it easier to do cross-country business through greater uniformity. It also aimed to tighten up data protection legislation for greater accountability by both data controllers and data processors, which is the language used in the legislation rather than organizations. The new General Data Protection Regulation is just that. It is a regulation, it is not a directive, which means that any organization that collects and processes data must immediately abide by its provisions. They do not have to ratify it into local law. It is actually not a complete rewrite of the Data Protection Directive, but rather builds on its provisions. The first talk of the new regulation was in 2012, and it has taken a long time to come about. There has been fierce lobbying from parliamentarians in various countries which wanted it watered down, and many major multinational technology groups have tried to influence the decision. There were actually two drafts of the new regulation with different provisions. The EU Council wanted 2% of turnover as a sanction for non-compliance, whereas the European Parliament wanted 5%. The new regulation was provisionally agreed upon in December 2015, and the EU is now working on finalising it. Although no data has yet been set, it is highly likely that it will be early 2018 when organisations must comply with its provisions. Therefore, organisations have 2 years to prepare, but 2 years is short, and they need to start getting their houses in order now. They need to do what they can to improve their security posture and improve data protection capabilities. One of the best ways that they can prepare is to implement best practices. They should, for example, ensure that the SAN's top 20 critical controls are covered by technology and processes in their organisations. They should also look to frameworks like ISO 27001, which will help to ensure that appropriate technical and organisational measures are in place. This will help to prevent unauthorised or unlawful processing of or access to personal data, and it provides accreditation that the standards and controls the organisation has in place are adequate. Organisations could also choose to use ISO 27002, but this is a code of practice and does not provide the accreditation. However, either will show that the organisation has the appropriate safeguards in place. PCI DSS is another industry standard that all organisations that process data should be looking to implement. In terms of the impact the new General Data Protection Regulation will have on organisations, the first is that it's expanding the scope of who must comply. Any organisation that controls or processes data on EU citizens must comply, no matter where they are located or their data sets are stored. This means that organisations that are based outside of the EU but that process citizens' data will need to comply, including cloud-based processing operations that provide goods or services to EU citizens, or that monitor the behaviour of EU residents when the data processing is outside of the EU or performed on behalf of an EU-based organisation. The definition of personal data is being expanded. Under the regulation, personal data is defined as any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person who could be identified either directly or indirectly by an identifier such as a name, an identification number, location data, online identifier, or other factors specific to that person. The definition of sensitive data is also expanded to include genetic and biometric data, as well as online identifiers such as IP addresses, cookie identifiers, or other identifiers such as RFID tags. Data subject rights are being expanded, such as the right to be forgotten and the right to have inaccurate data corrected. In terms of breach notification, data collectors and processors must notify the relevant data protection regulators within 72 hours of the discovery of the data breach that could pose a significant risk for the rights and freedoms of the individuals concerned. Where there is considered to be a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the individuals, those individuals must be notified without undue delay. Even where breaches do not need to be notified, records must be kept by the data processors or controllers involved. An exception is provided where data was encrypted and it is unlikely that the data subject will be harmed. Notification should include categories of data and the number of individuals impacted, as well as the measures that are being taken to remediate the breach. Fines for violations of the provisions of the Data Protection Regulation have increased dramatically, providing for much higher sanctions than any member state had written into its laws over and above the provisions of the Data Protection Directive of 1995. Data protection authorities can now impose fines for non-compliance of up to 4% of an organisation's worldwide revenue, or 20 million euros, whichever is higher, for a very serious offence. For more minor breaches, fines of up to 2% of worldwide turnover, or 10 million euros, whichever is higher, can be imposed. However, warnings can be given for first, minor offences. A data protection officer must be appointed by organisations for which data processing is a core activity or where sensitive data is processed on a large scale. In practice, this will mean that a data protection officer must be appointed for processing organisations with more than 250 employees or that hold records of 5,000 or more. SMEs for which data processing is not a core activity are exempt from this requirement. Data protection officers must be fully independent and may not take instructions from data controllers or processors. The position may be outsourced and one data protection officer can be shared among organisations. A data protection impact assessment must be conducted prior to processing where that processing is deemed to be at high risk for the freedoms and rights of the individuals concerned. This should assess the particular likelihood and severity of risk, taking into account the nature, scope, context and purposes of the processing and the sources of risk. It should outline the envisaged measures, safeguards and mechanisms for mitigating risk and for ensuring compliance with the provisions of the regulation. As the data on this slide show, encryption was called out as the top technology investment for data protection. The General Data Protection Regulation is non-prescriptive in terms of the technology that is required, but so are many regulations. If it were too prescriptive, it would probably not stand the test of time. The only technologies that are called out are encryption and pseudonymization, which obscures information so that it cannot be attributed to a specific individual. The regulation specifically says that breach notification is not required if data was encrypted. So organisations should encrypt everything that is internal to the organisation and everything that could compromise an individual in order to ensure that sensitive data is safeguarded. This means not just structured data, such as that in databases, but also unstructured data stored in spreadsheets, Word documents, emails, presentations, and archives. However, whilst encryption should be the default choice for every organisation and will dramatically lessen the impact of the regulation, it is not by itself enough. Organisations should deploy strong access controls that audit and report on authorisations granted to users. They should ensure that access controls are applied to encrypted data so that only those with the correct entitlements can access such data, and they should ensure that they control what they can do with it. These access controls should be integrated with corporate directories, ensure that an authorised person cannot give access to another person. As shown on this slide, organisations should tie their access controls and the encryption in with analytics and reporting capabilities for greater visibility over who is accessing what. They should combine it with other forensic information in a seamless system, which can help to identify and track emerging issues and threats. And this will also provide strong audit and reporting capabilities. With the right technologies and processes in place, this regulation need not be feared. Since you can download these slides, I've included this slide just as a summary of the major changes introduced in the General Data Protection Regulation. I shall now hand over to Charles Goldberg of Vormetric, who will take a deeper look at data security technologies.
Great. Thank you, Fran, for that introduction and for letting us know that if we follow good best practices in securing our data, that we really don't have to fear these regulations that are coming fast. 2 years is not a long time to secure any kind of large organization with a lot of data. So my name is Charles Goldberg. I run product marketing for Vormetric, and I want to take you through the Vormetric solution and how we help organizations meet compliance and secure their data today. So first, a little bit about Vormetric. We focus on data at rest, encryption, and control. We've been around for almost 15 years, and we have over 1,500 customers around the world. Much of those customers are the largest enterprises and brand names that you know. And also, if you go to many service providers, cloud providers, hosting providers, or if you're using a SaaS service and you want to know that your data is encrypted, or you want to buy encryption and key management services from them, they'll say, yeah, absolutely, we can sell you those services, but they're built on Vormetric technology. So we have to start securing a lot of our data in the European Union and outside the European Union, because anywhere that there's a European Union citizen data, right, that there's an expectation that that data is going to meet the compliance rules set by GDPR, and if not, the long arm of the EU Commission is going to in places. Right? It's going to be on endpoints. It's going to be on servers. It's all kinds of different servers, file servers, app servers, database servers. And the amount of environments that the data could be on is growing at a fantastic rate. Right? There's no such thing as the cloud. There's many clouds. There's different infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. Most of our organizations are using many software as a service solutions, very rapidly moving to multiple big data environments, some of those on-prem, some off-prem, and then there's storage. And storage is also going through so much changes right now. So it's just very difficult to identify where that sensitive data is and then govern that data. And then you take into account new regulations come, and what you thought wasn't regulated data is now regulated. So what are people doing? And one of those answers is they're rolling out encryption, and this is some results from Poneman. They've been tracking this for a long time, and they ask enterprise customers worldwide, when you look at an encryption, do you look at this as a strategy for your company, or as something that you think of maybe behind the scenes or after you have a breach or after you get audited and they say you need to show control over your data. And things have changed a lot over the last 10 years. So almost 40% of enterprise customers now think of encryption as part of their strategy whenever they roll out a new project or service. And very few, 15%, don't consider encryption as part of that strategy. IANS also did a survey. This was a US-centric survey, but it was to 100 large enterprise IT executives, and 84% of them said that they are considering implementing a secure everything strategy when they roll out new projects. So what has that turned into? So for many organizations, this means a lot of different encryption solutions or tokenization type solutions, because depending on what problem they're trying to solve, it may take different technologies. So it may be a mix of database encryption from a database vendor. It could be a drive encryption, which then needs some key management. It could be how do I secure the new services I'm rolling out in the cloud. And when you start pulling in a lot of different vendors, a lot of different solutions, maybe building a lot homegrown, you have a very complex, inefficient, and expensive system to procure and maintain at your company. And this is exactly the problem that Vormetric saw coming several years ago, and we launched what we call the Vormetric Data Security Platform. And the beauty of the Vormetric Data Security Platform is it's a collection of different types of encryption services that are very easy to deploy and operate and offer almost no disruption to your environment. And the operational simplicity and beauty of this solution is no matter how you're controlling your data, all the key management is centrally controlled with the Vormetric Data Security Manager. So you might be wondering, well, why is there different types of encryption solutions? And it's because data can live in different places, fall into different types of regulations, and you may have different security goals. It's always going to be the safest to encrypt data at closest to the source, which usually means the application, or at least within the database itself. Of course, that would add more complexity if you need to build it into the application. So what Vormetric offers to reduce that complexity are tools like Vormetric Application Encryption or Vormetric Tokenization, which opens well-defined APIs that your developers could use to add encryption or tokenization into applications. Now, your developers do not need to become cryptographers. They do not need to become experts in key management. They simply need to look at these APIs. So, for example, tokenizations or REST APIs, most of our developers know how to work with those, and they could add tokenization very quickly into an existing application. Other solutions that Vormetric offers is Vormetric Transparent Encryption. This is a file system solution. And the beauty of a file system solution is it's applied in Windows, Linux, or Unix operating systems, and you don't have to change the application at all. The user experience doesn't change at all. We don't care what the underlying storage is that's holding that data, and we don't care if it's structured data or unstructured data. So it could be files or databases. All that's transparent, so Vormetric Transparent Encryption. So the challenge when you're moving into certain cloud services like Box or S3 is you don't have access to the file system. In that case, you deploy the Vormetric Cloud Encryption Gateway. The Vormetric Cloud Encryption Gateway will ensure your data is encrypted on your premise, where your keys will be kept before the data reaches that cloud storage environment. And then the only way to get the data back is to bring it back through your premise where it gets decrypted. So you don't have to worry about anyone compromising your data while it's off your premise. And then in the case where you do use things like full disk encryption for physical security, in case the drive is stolen out of your data center or improperly retired and thrown away and someone tries to take the data off that drive, you need to worry about key management. All too often, the keys themselves are actually on the drives and with the hardware or kept in like a spreadsheet where they could easily be compromised. So you always want to have proper key management, and Vormetric will handle that as well. What I want to focus on right now is our file system solution, Vormetric Transparent Encryption, because this is what we sell the most of. And the reason we move so much of this and our customers like to deploy it is because it meets 90% of their use cases. For the other 10% where they need their tokenization for PCI, as Fran was talking about, or they want to add application level encryption or gateway encryption for data being stored in S3, then we have those solutions as well. But it's Vormetric Transparent Encryption that gets deployed the most. And the reason is it's far more than just encryption. So first, of course, it's going to encrypt the data, but then it's going to do access control. And Fran was talking about how important access control is. So you could set policies in this agent, what users and what processes or applications are allowed to access that data. So if it's a database, like an Oracle database, it should only be the strings process. It should be the Oracle processes getting to that data. If it's not, why would you let that traffic through? And the result is anyone that tries to access the data who is not authorized or using an authorized process, or it could be a whole other set of granular policies that you want to set, will be denied access. So let me give you a perfect example. You have a root user in your system. Right now, that root user could do a switch user command, turn themselves into an authorized user, and easily access the data. In fact, if you have any malware or APT on your server right now, that's what it's doing. It's collecting credentials, it's looking for privileged user credentials, using those privileged user credentials to then access your data, clean up logs, and send that data home. With Vormetric Transparent Encryption in place, those methods of attacking your data won't work because we know that it's a privileged user, not an authorized user, and we could set policies where that user is allowed to do their job, such as copy and move files, but not actually see the file or database contents. So if they try to steal the data, they're just getting encrypted garbage. So you're thinking, all right, that's great, Charles, but there's people that could get under the file system. There's my storage admins, my cloud admins. They don't care about a Linux kernel. Like they could take the stuff right off the disk. Well, in that case, it's encrypted, so they're not getting anything. So the third thing that makes Vormetric very unique is the continuous monitoring or the security intelligence logs that Vormetric Transparent Encryption creates. So because we're doing this continuous access control, every one time someone tries to access the data, we're creating logs. Those logs will tell you exactly who's accessing the data and what data they're trying to access. And I'm going to show you how we could use that to detect abuse. Now, you could have these agents all spread out across your enterprise on all kinds of different servers. They could be on big data nodes. They could be in the cloud. They could be across your file servers. And this could be a lot of agents. I mean, in fact, we have customers with 10, 15,000 agents deployed. Many, many customers with several hundred agents deployed. But managing the policy of these agents and collecting these logs is very simple because it's all centrally done with the Vormetric Data Security Manager. And this Vormetric Data Security Manager meets FIPS 140-2, Level 1, Level 2, or Level 3 compliance. So if you want a software version, we offer you a virtual appliance. If you need FIPS 140-2 Level 3 certification, we have a hardware appliance that meets that standard. All right, so let's take a look at how Vormetric does encryption, access control, and security intelligence. Let's bring that all together. So Vormetric is the only data at rest encryption solution that has pre-integration with almost every major SIM provider. So IBM QRadar, HP ArcSight, Logarithm, Intel Security, McAfee, ESM, the former Nitro product. The list goes on. What we're looking at here is Splunk, and this is the Vormetric app downloaded from Splunkbase. It gives you about 30 different dashboards, and I'm zooming into the one that says all denied events by users. So you could be getting a lot of logs from a lot of places, Vormetric just being, one of those log sources. So how do you find those users that might be abusing your system? You visualize them with tools like Splunk. So I see someone named Dirk. They're showing up with a lot of denied events, and I don't know who that person is and why they would have so many denied events on this day. So I simply click on that in Splunk, and it's going to take me to the very specific logs that are causing this event. And these logs give you amazing detail. And I challenge you to ask your IT team to see if they could tell you this data today. So for example, I know that this was an administrator named Dirk. They imitated another user named Steve, and I even know his LDAP group. And imitated means they must have done a command like switch user or sudo type commands. They attempted a read process. I could tell you they tried to read this file called spies list. Don't worry, they were denied access, so they didn't steal the data because they violated a policy called top secret, and that policy is in the data security manager. So this is an incredible amount of information to detect if there's malware, APT, or a true abusive insider inside your network. And your perimeter security would never see this, right? Because there'd be no NetFlow data, no firewall logs, no IPS logs, because this is happening on the server itself. So this is what Vormetric delivers. We have data at rest encryption, access control, auditing logs, all what Fran was recommending that you have in your solution to be GDPR ready. And it works across physical, virtual, and outsourced environments, across public and private hybrid clouds, remote servers, Windows, Linux, and Unix, as well as big data and IoT environments. So whatever use case you have coming up, whatever your next project is, Vormetric's going to be ready to help you meet your security and compliance needs. So if you want to know more about what we talked about in this presentation and learn more about using encryption to help meet the GDPR regulations, we invite you to download this wonderful white paper written by Fran. It's available on Vormetric.com, and we have the URL here. And if you'd just like to learn more about Vormetric or you have questions for Fran, we invite you to contact us directly as well. So with that said, if there's any questions, Fran and I would be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Charles, for that presentation, and Fran, too, for helping us with a better understanding of the GDPR. We have time for a few questions now, so I'd like to start with this one. Do we think that the fear of breaking the GDPR rules are going to dampen innovation within the EU?
Well, I could take that first, being from California. So Fran mentioned that we have a law there. We love our numbers. It's State Bill 1386, and that's been in effect since 2003. And it says if you have a breach, you need to notify those consumers who lost their data, which essentially means, besides notifying those users, you're in the press. If you're any company of size, like Fitbit recently lost all my GPS data, so some hacker knows when I'm awake and when I'm asleep and when I'm home and when I'm in London.
Right.
So I know that because of these breach notification laws. So that's there, but I challenge anyone to find a more innovative place than Silicon Valley. So even though California was the first to put those laws in place in the U.S., it certainly hasn't, hurt any kind of, innovation for us.
Mm. Yes.
I agree with Charles as well, though, because there have been breach notification mandates in several countries in Europe already, and it really hasn't stifled innovation at all. It's just something that everyone's going to have to face now.
Excellent. So you mentioned in your presentation that the number of breaches just keeps increasing. Do you think that putting these rules in place is going to actually reduce the number of breaches, or are we going to see more breaches?
But I think we're still going to keep on seeing breaches because attackers are just so sophisticated now. But the whole point of this regulation is to stop breaches and make organisations more accountable for their data security. So I think why we will see more breaches coming, but this is not supposed to be a tax on organisations. It is supposed to improve data security across the board.
Yeah, and I agree, and I'll add to that. So I think we continue to see more breaches, and certainly we hear a lot of that news out of the United States. And it's for two reasons. One, there's far more data than ever before, and far more consumer data than ever before. It's not just credit card information. It's healthcare data. It's, Fitbit, the most recent example. It's Uber drivers. They lost their data not too long ago. So it's just more data for the taking, but also when the data is taken, we know about it. And I do feel that's why we hear about so many breaches out of the U.S., because almost all the states have these breach notification laws. And so they're being reported on. We see the charts going up to the right. But if those laws weren't in place, far more data, I believe, would be taken because there would be no pressure on these companies to protect the data because they wouldn't have to be embarrassed by the situation or be held legally culpable for losing that data.
Right. So it's a good thing, and it's not going to dampen innovation. How does this legislation affect cross-border data stored in the cloud or in data centers?
Well, it affects all data, no matter where it's stored, if it is of an EU citizen. So it doesn't really matter if it's in the cloud, in a data center, in a database. It is just all data. But what has been happening recently is some of the larger cloud providers that are based in the US have been opening up data centers to provide cloud services within the EU to their citizens. We've also seen safe harbor is no longer valid. So this is one reason why they're doing this, is so they don't have to transfer data and use binding corporate rules or standard clauses, which have to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm. Right. How direct is the legislation on how companies must prepare and react to the legislation? I mean, is it how prescriptive is it? Is it suggested and advised, or organizations must do this?
Well, they don't use the word organization. They use data controllers, who are the people who decide what data to collect, and data processors. And the wording that is used throughout is data controllers or processors shall. So it is prescriptive in that, but it doesn't actually say what technology should be used. It's just they shall use the right technical and organizational safeguards.
So it's results-based. It's what are the outcomes?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I'll just add to that is, and as Fran talked about earlier, one technology that they do point out as something that would help meet, so they don't say you have to use encryption, but they use that a couple of times through the draft, saying, such as encryption. So, that's going to be strong guidance to a compliance officer and a data protection officer that we know this is going to meet the test of, doing your due diligence and putting in the appropriate types of security technologies.
No, my understanding, the speculation is that if data is lost and you can say, yes, it was definitely encrypted, that means that they will, that they'll look kindly upon that.
Yes, they will. The breach notification is not mandatory in the case of encryption, as long as it is properly implemented.
Right.
And by the way, we have that in California and most of the state breach notification laws as well. We call that encryption safe harbor, very different from the safe harbor we were talking about earlier.
Right. Okay. So one of the questions I had is where processing is deemed to be a high risk for individuals' rights, you have to do a risk assessment. But how do you deem whether it's high or low risk?
It depends on how it will impact their rights and freedoms and how sensitive the data is. And organizations also have to assess what sort of risks their particular organization faces, as well as those impacting the particular industry sector in which they operate. So it will vary amongst organisations, but it is rather subjective. I agree with you.
It is a subjective, right? Okay. And then with the sanctions and fines, what's going to constitute a major or minor breach? I mean, because they're talking about, a major breach will attract fines of up to 4% of global turnover, and a minor breach would be up to 2% of global turnover. So how do they make the distinction? Are there any indications yet about how they're going to do that?
There aren't actually at this point any indications. I think you might see it vary on a country-by-country basis, but this is a regulation that they are still ironing out some of the details, so it may be that that wording is put in the final version of this regulation, but there's no indication yet.
Right, okay, interesting. So one of the questions I was wondering about with the Vormetric technology, and I suppose, this sort of technology in general is, will deploying so much encryption slow down applications and hinder the user experience?
Yeah, this is definitely a perception on encryption, and I would say it's really a perception now, and people need to really deploy modern encryption solutions to experience the reality. So what usually impacts the act of encrypting or contributes to slowing applications down is the actual math it takes to do the encryption. But when you look at modern systems, and I'm not talking about modern like the last 2 years, but really the last decade, all these servers have built-in hardware support for encryption. So, for example, Intel calls that AES-NI. And AMD and Oracle Sun and IBM Power Chips, they all have something similar. And in a properly implemented encryption solution, like Vormetric, we heavily rely on that built-in hardware to do the actual algorithm, the math, the AES part of the act of encrypting. So that offloads a lot of processing from the CPU. And you don't see big CPU hits like you may have when it was all done in software in the past. And additionally, a solution like Vormetric, we actually have more file system engineers than we actually have cryptographers. And the reason is we have a lot of enterprise class software company partners. So think of your big data vendors, your SAP HANAs of the world, Hortonworks. And we optimize at the file system level to perform very, very well. And this is by doing things like look-ahead caching, very good asymmetrical pipelining of the data. And this really mitigates any kind of performance impact that traditional encryption may have had.
Right. So does encryption at the application and the server level, does that mitigate the need for encryption at the endpoint?
No, definitely not. So, although Vormetric focuses on server encryption, and that's critical because if you want to steal a lot of data, you're going to the servers, right? You want millions and millions of records or tens of millions of records, you're taking that off a database server, right? But what gets taken out of a trunk of a car is when there's a smash and grab, it's the laptop, or the phone. If somebody forgets something in a cab, right, it's often that laptop. So you should definitely be encrypting on endpoints as well, because although it's not the tens of millions of records, there's certainly a lot of sensitive data, and there's no reason that anyone that's carrying sensitive data on their laptop shouldn't have an enterprise-class laptop with full disk encryption built in. And similarly, if you're doing business and you keep business data on your mobile device, you really should have one of the operating systems that does device-level encryption to make it difficult for anyone that steals your device to be able to pull that data off.
Excellent. Okay. And well, that's really it. I think we've come to the end of our questions for the day. I'd just like to thank our speakers, Fran Howarth from Bloor Research and Charles Goldberg from Vormetric. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for listening and sending in your questions. It remains for me to say that you can listen again to this webcast by visiting our website, scmagazineuk.com. Just hover over the Events tab and click on Webcasts. So once again, thanks for listening and goodbye.